Delighted to welcome everyone to this webinar with Dr. Nigel Strauss. Nigel, are you there? We'll be introducing you in a moment, but I just want to check that Nigel's there. Is Nigel's mic unmuted?
I'm here as far as I know, Tanya. Can you hear me?
You are there. Thank you, Nigel. I'll just pin you. Welcome, Nigel.
Thanks, Tanya.
We're very honoured to have you sharing your immense wisdom in this space again. It's something we really value, and we're looking forward to hearing from you very soon. So I'm just going to run through a little bit of background on Mind Medicine Australia for those of you who are less familiar with us. I'm not sure how many people are new to Mind Medicine Australia. And we're going to start off now with, Ilan, if you move to the next slide, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, so basically, again, just reinforcing this fact that we don't promote illegal use of psychedelics or plant medicines. And we are recording this webinar, so please don't discuss any names, locations, or specific details of illegal use. You can talk about how psychedelics have healed you. That is absolutely fine. And we also welcome testimonials from those of you that have had healing through these medicines, and we have a page on our website of testimonials. Next slide, thank you. So the mental illness crisis that we're experiencing at the moment is really quite devastating. And even before COVID and even before the bushfires, mental illness statistics in Australia were at alarming levels. We are bottom in the world, only ahead of Iceland. So that's not a very good indictment of Australia's mental health system. 1 in 5 Australian adults have a chronic mental illness. 1 in 8 Australians are now on antidepressants, including 1 in 4 older Australians. An average of 8 people were taking their lives before this current crisis, and over 45% of Australians are estimated to experience a mental illness in their lifetime. Experts are now saying that due to the current crisis, those figures could increase by 20 to 30%, which is quite significant. So we'll go on now to the next slide, Ilan. Next slide, Ilan. Okay, I think Ilan might have, So we're an Australian registered charity with, just back one please, Ilan. Back one slide, thank you, yes. With DGR1 status, seeking to broaden the treatment paradigm available to medical practitioners and their patients and improve treatment effectiveness by establishing safe, accessible and effective medicine-assisted psychotherapy in Australia for major mental illnesses. Our primary focus at the moment is on medicinal psilocybin and medicinal MDMA. And our goal is that these therapies become an integral part of our mental health system, so that if you go and see a specialist like Nigel or your doctor, that your doctor might say to you, well, you can have antidepressants, you can go and see a psychiatrist or psychologist, or there's a third option, which is psychedelic-assisted therapies. And they provide you full disclosure on the benefits and risks of all different treatments. The high remission rates from these particular treatments are remarkable, an average of 60 to 80% in current and recent trials after just 2 to 3 treatments. Our goal is that these treatments become available, accessible, affordable to all Australians in need. Next slide, thank you. Next slide, please. So there's been no improvement in treatment outcomes for the past 50 years. There's been no treatment innovation in that period of time. And this is why we have this major crisis at the moment, because there simply aren't enough tools in the toolbox of psychiatrists, and Nigel will talk further about that. Only a small percentage of sufferers experience actual remission from antidepressants or psychotherapy, and the relapse rates are high. The side effects of antidepressants are high. It's very difficult also to withdraw from antidepressants. In the case of PTSD, the remission rates are even lower, and there's even less solutions for people who are suffering from PTSD. So more of the same approach is not going to solve the problem. Next slide. Something very slow. So the primary focus that we're focused on with medicinal psilocybin is around outcomes for depression and potentially obsessive compulsive disorder and addiction, and medicinal MDMA for PTSD, and also possibly the treatment of addiction. As I mentioned before, only 2 to 3 dose sessions, in contrast to conventional treatments, often involving daily medications, weekly psychotherapy, in many cases for people's, whole life or decades. The other wonderful thing about these medicines is that they're considered extremely safe in medically controlled environments and are non-addictive. And in fact, as you can see, these medicines are being used to actually treat addiction. Both medicines have been granted breakthrough therapy designation by the Food and Drug Administration in the US to help fast track the approval process. And this sort of designation is very rare. It's only given to medicines that are considered vastly superior to current existing treatments. Next slide, thank you. So there's 4 key strategic areas that Mind Medicine Australia is focusing on to build the ecosystem to make these medicines available in Australia. The first one is awareness and knowledge building, and so tonight's event is around that. Hosting regular events, education, a major international medical summit in November this year, and we'll talk further about that, which we hope can go ahead, and COVID willing, and if not, will be moved to early next year. But at the moment, looks very promising, with 15 incredible international leaders, as well as Australian speakers as well, researchers and others. We're also looking at promoting and funding relevant novel research, and we're commencing state and regional chapters. So we now have a number of chapters, both in capital cities around Australia and regional and rural areas, as well as New Zealand. And we even have interest from Asia in starting chapters. The second very exciting part of our strategy is the development of a certificate in psychedelic therapies. That will commence in early 2021. We're very excited to have brought to Australia a leading clinical psychologist who's worked on the psilocybin trials in the UK, and she is developing this course using some of the most wonderful other courses around the world as a base to develop a course that's specific for Asia and Australia. We're also looking at setting up an Asia Pacific Centre of Excellence for applied research and development, supply chains and agribusiness, looking at how we make these medicines available in Australia, education and economic analysis, and so on. And then finally, we're looking at the legal and ethical frameworks for these medicines. We have set up a psychological support services team that provides support to doctors and their patients and others who are using the medicines and need further support. And we're looking at a rollout strategy for clinics. So I'm going to move now to the next slide, and delighted to welcome again Dr. Nigel Strauss, who's considered one of the leaders really in the world as a psychiatrist, who has been interested in these medicines for many years, and is highly experienced. We had a wonderful webinar with him a couple of weeks ago where I think we all learnt a lot, and we're very much looking forward, Nigel, to hearing from you tonight. So over to you. Round of applause, virtual hands clap. Congratulations.
Thanks, Tanya. Thanks, Tanya, and hello everybody again. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking to you tonight. Now, the talk that I'm giving tonight is on psychiatry and psychedelics, and I want to talk about them as narratives. They're stories, the story of psychiatry and the story of psychedelics. And what I'll be talking about is how these narratives, these stories, because they are stories really, stem from the same source and have gone in different directions, and now we're in a situation where we're bringing them back together again. And I'll elaborate on that as I go. But it's the use of psychedelic medicines in psychiatry has to be done very carefully and with proper thought, I think, going into the philosophy of it and why we're trying to do it. Because, as you well know, 50 years ago, we tried to do it and it didn't work. I just want to show you the next slide now, just to illustrate that point. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, there it is. Back in 1968, and that's 50 years ago, the Royal Australian College of Physicians put out a statement saying that undoubtedly there is scope for the use of psychedelics in research and psychotherapy. And my college, the College of Psychiatrists in 1972, nearly 50 years ago, said there is a distinctive place for the use of psychedelic medicines in the treatment of neurosis. Well, here we are 50 years later, and we still are not freely using these. Now, if you could go back one slide, please. That's it. We're still not using these drugs freely, even though those recommendations were made 50 years ago. So it's an indication of the difficulty of bringing these drugs into usage and introducing them so that they will help people. And I think we have to be very careful and do this with great consideration, because I'd hate to see the drugs introduced too quickly or erratically or not with enough care, so that further problems might develop, and that would be a great pity. It's a very fragile situation in some ways. I think we have to appreciate that. So the approach I'm going to take tonight is slightly philosophical. I hope you'll excuse me on that. Could I have a look at the next slide, please? This is a quote from Albert Einstein. Can we have the next slide, please? And he said this, I'll read it to you. It's a great quote. He wrote it in correspondence in 1944. I believe that the history and philosophy of science are just as important as methodology. So many professional scientists seem to me like somebody who has seen thousands of trees but has never seen a forest. A knowledge of the historic and philosophical background of their area of expertise gives that kind of independence from prejudices, underlined, of their generation from which most scientists are suffering. This independence created by philosophical insight is, in my opinion, the mark of distinction between a mere artisan or specialist and a real seeker after truth. I love that phrase, seeker after truth. So that's the approach. If you get the gist of that, that's the approach I really want to take tonight, to sort of go beyond the boundaries that are normally set. So what is it? Can we go to the next slide, please? What is it that psychiatry and psychedelics have in common? Well, it's pretty obvious that their prefix is the same, psyche, that word psyche. And it's a very interesting word. It comes from the name of a very beautiful young woman who was the main person in a Greek classic myth called Psyche and Eros, or Psyche and Cupid. And she was so beautiful that she caused the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite, to become very jealous, and she sent her son down, Cupid, with his bow and arrows, and instead of shooting Psyche with the intention that the first person that Psyche would see would be a monster, and that's what Aphrodite wanted to do. She wanted Psyche to fall in love with a monster. In fact, Cupid shot himself with the arrow and fell in love with Psyche, and so the myth goes on for a long time, and it's a tragic story about all the challenges that Psyche had to meet. But like a lot of myths, it tells a story, and it's the story of consciousness, of human consciousness, of the mind. The word originally meant soul or spirit. We're not allowed to use that in psychiatry, and so it's come to mean consciousness or mind. And I'm going to be talking about mind a lot tonight. Mind is what you're using, your consciousness, to listen to me tonight, all the things that you're experiencing at the moment and every moment of your life, the stream of consciousness that involves thoughts and feelings, imaginings, memories, and so forth, the phenomenological approach to your experience of life, and that is mind. So that's what psyche, that's where it comes from. And it's interesting that psychiatry and psychology are really the study of mind. But what's happened, I think, over the years, you don't read about that in psychology or psychiatry textbooks. Really what's happened with psychiatry and psychology, it's become more brain orientated rather than mind orientated. And I think that that is a real issue. And I think we've got to keep in mind that psyche means mind. So let's move on to the next slide. And this is about shamanism. Now, a friend of mine, young researcher called Ruben, told me never to use the word shamanism in the same sentence as psychiatry. He said, I'll be thrown off the stage. But I've taken the risk, and I'm going to talk about it tonight, because a very notable psychiatrist called Alan Francis, he's written a book called Saving Normal. He's a very eminent psychiatrist, and he actually was the one who said that psychiatry, really the roots of psychiatry, began with shamanism. Shamanism goes back a long time and was very much part of the animistic culture where spirits were everywhere and the spirit world was quite significant. And the shamans were the people who knew in society what was going on. They were the ones who controlled society, and they were the ones who could tell the future, could tell what was going on. They could diagnose conditions. They treated people who were unwell. And they used various techniques such as rituals, dreams, trance states, and so forth to heal people who were having a really rough time. And they would often use psychedelic substances. Not always. They would sometimes use fasting or rituals or so forth, but very often that was their approach. And so that, according to Alan Francis, was where psychiatry began. Could we have the next slide, please? Now, the psychiatric narrative goes from there, from shamanism to the next stage of human development, where gods replaced spirits. And the priests became the people who, I'm just getting a call from Serbia. I don't know why that is. I'll hang up. The priests became they replaced the shamans, and they were at the interface between the gods and human beings. And they were the ones who then took over the management of people with psychiatric problems. And during that time when there were the gods, back in the Greek period, Hippocrates was the first doctor to introduce ideas about modern medicine. He was the one who developed the bedside manner. He was the one who developed ethics, and he was the one who really introduced the clinical approach to medicine. And unfortunately, things didn't go well because we went into the Dark Ages, and that was when people were affected by demonic possession and psychiatric patients were treated poorly. But more recently, with the Enlightenment and the evolution of science, psychiatric patients were treated more respectfully, and science became very much a part of medicine and psychiatry. So what's happened now, I think, in my opinion anyway, is that the psychiatric narrative, as I alluded to earlier, has been separated into two sub-narratives, the brain and the mind, just to put it very simply. And brain is science, neuroscience, and it's a very important part of psychiatry because it informs us of how things work on a more mechanical level. But mind is that thing that I talked about before, which is consciousness, what you're experiencing from moment to moment. And that's more of a psychological approach to psychiatry. And there is a tendency, I think now, and this is my opinion, and I don't want to upset anyone or offend anyone, but I think there's probably more of an emphasis on brain psychiatry than there is on mind psychiatry. And this sort of conflict, I call it a conflict, has been going on for some time. And very great psychiatrist called Professor Sidney Block wrote a paper called Psychiatry, the Impossible Profession. And in that paper, he talked about these two sub-narratives, which were very much part of the psychiatric story. And he proposed a very simple solution. Could we have the next slide, please? He proposed a three-legged stool. There we go. And he said that psychiatry should have three legs to it. One is based on science, that's brain. One is based on mind, and he called that the art of psychiatry. And one is based on ethics, that psychiatry should always be ethical. And that, of course, comes from Hippocrates, that we must maintain high standards. Psychiatrists can't cross certain boundaries, and they have to look after their patients. The Hippocratic Oath is do no harm. And that's very much part of medicine. And I'd proudly say very much part of psychiatry. But we are there to help people and look after people and do it properly. So one of the points that I want to make here is that science can inform psychiatry to a certain point, but there are limitations. Could we have the next slide, please? There are three blind spots of science, and people talk about this quite a lot now. The limitations of science are to do with size and with consciousness. We can't, I won't labour this because it's a bit off the point, but I'll mention it anyway. It's quite interesting. Cosmology is big. We can't step out of the universe and measure it. Science is all about measurement. We can't step out of it. We're a fish in a fish tank. We can't step out and measure what's going on inside because we're inside and we can't get out. So we're limited cosmologically. We're limited when things get very small. If in very small particles, if we try and measure very small particles, we interfere with the measurement, and that's the uncertainty principle. That's quantum mechanics. And the third area where science can't help us absolutely is consciousness. We can't actually get into your mind or my mind and absolutely measure what's going on. We just can't do it. We're all different, and our consciousness, our subjectivity is unique to us. So this results in, next slide, please. This results in certain limitations for psychiatry. Now, again, I'm going to be criticised here because I'm being a bit critical of psychiatry, but I think that it's worth emphasising this, that psychiatry does have its objective limitations. We try and talk about psychiatry as a scientific pursuit, but there are a number of issues where there are limitations. First of all, the pathogenesis, the cause of so many psychiatric conditions remains unknown. We don't really know what causes depression. We've got our theories, our ideas and so forth, but we don't have absolute ideas. It's not like in the rest of medicine, when you break a bone, you know what the pathogenesis is. It's the broken bone and it leads to symptoms. In psychiatry, we have the symptoms, maybe depression, maybe psychosis, but we don't know what causes it. And because of that, our diagnoses are based not so much on it can't be based on the pathogenesis because we don't know the cause. We base it on what our patients tell us. We have a list of symptoms, and that's okay, but we do need to have diagnoses, but they're not valid diagnoses. They're based on symptoms, and that is a limitation too. And we don't know how a lot of our treatments work in psychiatry. We can put electricity in the brain or magnets on the brain or give people tablets, but again, we don't know what it is that causes some of these people to get better. We don't have diagnostic tests in psychiatry. We can't x-ray the brain and diagnose depression, like you can x-ray a bone and see it's broken. And in psychiatry, as Alan Francis says in his book, we really can't define normal. We don't know what normal is, and therefore it's very hard to define abnormal. So you can see the battle we have in psychiatry. It's a great challenge, and there are many good, no, we're not ready for that one yet. There are many good psychiatrists. Can we go back, please? There are many good psychiatrists who are doing a great job. I'm not criticising psychiatrists. I'm just saying we're limited in the work that we do. And there's a lovely quote, so we're ready for the next slide. This is a quote from Maimonides, who was a great Jewish physician in the Middle Ages. He said, "Any sick individual presents new problems. One can never say one disease is just like the other. The physician should not treat the disease, but the patient who is suffering from it." And that it applies to all of medicine, but particularly to psychiatry, because of those limitations that I've pointed out to you. Okay, so if we can move to the next slide, this leaves that third leg. I was talking about the art of psychiatry. What's the art of psychiatry? Now, of course, that's not an empirical science. It's an art, and I like to call it an art. And that involves psychotherapy, the way that the therapist or the doctor or the psychiatrist deals with his or her patients or clients. It involves empathy. A good doctor always tries to understand where the patient's mind is, what's going on inside the patient's mind or consciousness. And you need empathy to do that, to get inside there, to help the patient or client heal themselves. And of course, you've got to act compassionately. So empathy and compassion are very important attributes as part of the art of psychiatry. But for a good psychiatrist or psychologist or doctor, but in the psychological area particularly, I believe that treaters really need to have an experience of life. And the best way to learn about minds and consciousness is to look at the manifestations of consciousness, art, the things that mind and consciousness create, like art and music, literature, stories. There's a wealth of information in all of those that can teach the psychiatrist or the psychologist how minds work and what minds manifest. A great understanding. And it was, I think, Socrates who said sorry, it wasn't Socrates, I'm getting confused. It was a guy called William Dalrymple, who wrote for The Spectator. He was a doctor, and he wrote, he was a good writer, and he said once that if he had to choose between two doctors who had the same experience, he'd like to go to the one who read Chekhov, because that doctor was much more worldly than the doctor who didn't. Now, the other thing that informs the art of psychiatry are the social sciences. Could we have the next slide, please? This is a sort of scheme that I dreamt up. It's nothing complicated, but you can see what informs, what ideally should inform psychiatry. Medicine and science obviously inform psychiatry. That's what I've been talking about. Now, the art of psychiatry comes from the north of this, in this diagram, from psychology and from a whole lot of other social sciences. Say theology. Theology is the understanding of the transcendent, or the importance that people place on spiritual values, on God and their belief systems, often culturally contrived or developed. And to understand theological ideas is very helpful to understand psychological ideas. Then there's wisdom and philosophy. There's Western wisdom, which teaches us there's nothing wrong with wisdom. If you're going to be a good psychologist, I think it's good to be wise. And so Western philosophy is very important, but Eastern philosophy too is very important, because that's more experiential. People who meditate learn about their own consciousnesses. They learn about their own mind, and they can then extrapolate to other people's minds. What's anthropology and sociology done to inform psychiatry? Well, that's taught us not to have value judgments about people who are from other cultures, not to make judgments about people who are different. And that's very important in psychiatry too. And then we come to probably what's the most important aspect, in my opinion, of the art of psychiatry, is hermeneutics. And it's a big word. What does that mean? Well, it simply means the study or interpretation of meaning. Can we go to the next slide, please? Meaning is a hard thing to define, but it's really, to put it colloquially, it's what people care about, the importance of meaning, what we all care about. The meanings that we have in our lives are about the things that we care, whether it be people or causes or things that we do, or football teams that we barrack for. All these things provide us with meaning. And it's a very important part of life, but it's a basic need. But first, we've got to have a full tummy, we've got to have somewhere to live and all those things. If you're starving, meaning is probably less important. But if those things are satisfied, meaning becomes very important. And meaning is really to do with connections. It's the connections we have, but both emotionally and cognitively, with all these other aspects in our lives. They can be positive. We can have positive meaning. We can get a positive feedback from things, or there can be a negative valence where we don't like things, but they do have a negative meaning. Now, it's often said that if people don't have meaning in their lives, they become bored, and it can lead to depression. And also, if there's too much meaning in your life, if you're overwhelmed by meaning, that can cause psychosis. People get swamped by meaning and they get very confused and disturbed by excessive meaning. Then there's the placebo effect. That's a very powerful effect, and it's called the meaning response. So that I was talking before about shamans, they're very powerful people in society, and if they said something, if they told someone that they were going to die or they were going to get better, that would have a very profound effect. That's the placebo response I think we all know about, and it's very much underrated, I think, in psychiatry and medicine. It's a very powerful force. And finally, there's synchronicity, which I'm not going to go into. That's a Jungian term, which you would have heard of. 2 or more events which occur in a meaningful manner, but which are causally unrelated. So if we can move on to the next slide, it was a psychiatrist called Viktor Frankl, who was the psychiatrist who really emphasized the importance of meaning in psychiatry. He was a psychiatrist who was interned in concentration camps in the Second World War, and he came out and developed a whole psychology of meaning called logotherapy. And he said it was very important for people to lead meaningful lives. He was less concerned with absolute meaning, but he said that people had to make connections. It was their responsibility to go out and find meaning in their lives. And he helped people do that. And he said in this era of God was dead and people didn't have religious meaning and connection, it was much more common for people to lose their way and not have meaning. And Frankl emphasized this. And this is the point now where this is the point. If we have the next slide, which is a quote by a neurologist called Oliver Sacks. He emphasized, I like quotes because I think they emphasize the point. Oliver said that to speak of a biological basis and the biological precursors of religious emotion says nothing of the value, the meaning, the function of such emotions or of the narratives and beliefs we may construct on their basis. He emphasized the importance of meaning, not from a brain perspective, but from a mind perspective. And I think this is where psychedelic medicines become very important. Can we have the next slide? Because psychedelic medicines are drugs of meaning. When people are treated with psychedelic medicines, researchers talk of people having increased connectedness, increased meaning in their lives is introduced. They have heightened perception of life as meaningful. It's associated with very positive feelings of emotion and awe, and there's a merging of the self with the external world. Deep connections are formed. So this is my first point, and it's taken me a long time to get here, and I apologize for that. But psychedelic drugs the psychedelic narrative gives the psychiatric narrative this concept of meaning. Psychotherapy, of course, has been, could we have the next slide, please? Psychedelic therapy, what it does is it enhances meaning. And it's so important, such an important adjunct in psychotherapy that I think that psychiatry needs to welcome in the psychedelic narrative into the psychiatric narrative, because it adds meaning to the whole process of psychiatric treatment. It's a meaning enhancer. So the psychiatry needs psychedelics because of this process. And I think that's really the first point that I'd like to make tonight. So if that's what psychedelics can do for psychiatry, what can psychiatry do for psychedelics? Let's look at it from the other way around. And so if we look at the next slide, this is the psychedelic narrative. I've already talked about the psychiatric narrative. This is the psychedelic narrative. Now, the psychedelic narrative has been going on for thousands of years too. And there are still shamans about in indigenous cultures who still operate in the same way. But what's happened in the last 100 or 200 years is that, of course, Western science and Western explorers and a whole lot of people have gone out and explored this whole concept of psychedelia and started to use these drugs, and we've synthesized psychedelic drugs, and we've made them freely available. The mystery's really gone out of it. The control that shamans had within their culture, and these drugs have been for thousands of years very controlled and used appropriately, and not just in a random fashion. That's been lost in the last 100 or 200 years. And that's caused, I think, significant problems. There's a loss of control and a loss of common purpose. And the result of that is that we've got a whole lot of sub-narratives within the psychedelic narrative. Remember I said that with the psychiatric narrative, there are only two sub-narratives, brain and mind, but with the psychedelic narrative, if we could have the next slide, there's a whole range of sub-narratives. The word psychedelic has become a little bit like the word God, the words God and money. People project all sorts of things onto God, and they project all sorts of things onto money, and we project all sorts of things onto psychedelics. Some people just take them for hedonistic reasons. You just feel great, it's euphoric, you go and have a great dancing session. Then there are people who feel that they're really good for aesthetics. You've heard of psychedelic art and psychedelic music. Then there are those who think, oh, well, I mean, psychedelics are really powerfully creative. Look at Steve Jobs. He took psychedelic drugs and created his empire. There's talk that Francis Crick came up with the DNA molecule under the influence of psychedelics. That's very debatable, but nevertheless, it sort of remains a legend. Then there are those who really push microdosing, and they say that it enhances cognitive ability and productivity. There's the utopians, many of them from America, who think that psychedelics are going to make the world a better place. There are those who think psychedelics are a panacea, they're going to cure everything. There are those who are still opposed to psychedelics, and they're still pretty much in the majority, I think, in some places. They think that they're very dangerous drugs and they cause psychosis, self-harm and so forth, even genetic damage, although I think that's in the past a bit. Then there are those who see psychedelics as a product. The entrepreneurs are going to make money out of it. There are the popularizers like Michael Pollan, and he's done a good job and revealed a lot of ideas to people. There are issues there, but I won't go into it. Then there are people who think psychedelics are going to introduce you to God, and they take them for religious purposes. So there's this whole range of sub-narratives, and I'm not criticizing anybody or anything, but I'm just revealing that. That's what I believe. And I think in some ways that's problematic, because it may well slow down the development of the whole psychedelic process. And so what I'm talking about tonight is really my projection on psychedelics. If we could have the next slide, please. I believe that psychedelics need to be within the auspices of psychiatry, that we need to define psychedelics as a technology. A technology can be defined as a science or knowledge put into practical use to solve problems. And of course, with any technology, it's not the technology itself that has values, it's our attitude as human beings to what we do with the technology. So if you have a gun and it sits in a drawer, well, it's of not good or bad. But if I pull the gun out and I shoot someone, well, obviously it has a negative value. And similarly with psychedelics. The interesting thing about psychedelics as a technology, though, is that it affects consciousness and therefore affects our attitude. So it's a unique technology. It actually affects the way we see the psychedelic drug. And no other technology really does that. It affects our own objectivity, if you like. So what can psychiatry give to psychedelics? What does the psychiatric narrative give to the psychedelic narrative? Well, I've told you that the psychedelic narrative feeds art in psychiatry, and what psychiatry does for psychedelics is science. We have the next slide, please. We need to research scientifically these drugs. I think we're a long way from discovering how, in fact, they work. There's a lot of theories, but we've still got a long way to go because it's the brain and we don't know that much about the brain. But safety is very important. And I think that if people just take psychedelics, they are at risk. And if people want to cure themselves with psychedelics, oh, well, I've heard that if I take psilocybin because I'm depressed, I'll get better. But they don't appreciate that. They don't know that if they get the stuff illegally, they don't know the dose, they don't know what they're taking. And also, they don't really go through any sort of ritualistic treatment program with integration, which is very much part of psychedelic psychotherapy. They are prone to psychosis. There's all sorts of risks, and it's psychiatry that can offer that safe harbour because we work ethically. And ethics is the other thing that psychiatry can give psychedelics. Ethics and science, I think, are the major contributions that the psychiatric narrative can give to the psychedelic narrative. So that's the story, but I want to finish off now by just taking this one step further and coming up with just a concept that I've developed in relation to the transformative or the mystical or the peak experience, the psychedelic experience that happens when someone takes a psychedelic drug and has some sort of changed experience, the transformative or the mystical experience, because I think this is very much open to interpretation. And from a psychiatric point of view, if we look at it clearly, there are 5 basic interpretations of what a person experiences. Remember that when you take a psychedelic drug, you're very open to suggestion, very suggestible, and the meaning process is very important. You can interpret your experience in all sorts of ways, depending on your culture. So these 5 different headings that I'll be talking about in a minute are really open to the culture that you come from, the therapist or the person that you're with at the time, and it's very much open to interpretation. There's no fixed approach. So let's have a look at the next slide. So the first M is the mystical experience. This is the unitive experience where there is a dissipation of ego and you just merge into a sort of oceanic feeling. It's non-dual consciousness. And in our culture, that's very common because that's our cultural interpretation. But if you live in South America and you have a shaman where there are still spirits, then what they experience in, say, an ayahuasca ceremony is confrontation with a malevolent spirit that you have to deal with. So it's not a unitive experience, it's a dualistic experience. The third M is what I call mythological participatory spirituality. Now, that's mythological. There was the Eleusinian mysteries. I don't know if any of you have heard of those. I'm sure some of you have. But back in Greek times, there were these very elaborate ceremonies that went on for several days in a town called Eleusis, which was very close to Athens. It was very theatrical. People would pay money to participate, and they would end up in Eleusis, where they had these secret auditoriums where they would have a sort of a light show in a sense, and it was all to do with the myth of Demeter, and it was a sort of a birth-death myth where she was involved in the loss of her daughter Persephone. I won't go into the myth, but people would live through these experiences and it would be very challenging, and they would come out the other side and their lives would be changed, and many philosophers and so forth participated in that. So that's a sort of a mythological, where it's scripted almost, and people would go through this process when the ceremonies were on. The next slide is another way of interpreting the transformative experience. This one's more amusing. It's a mechanical materialistic approach where people interpret their experience in a much more materialistic way. Carhart Harris, who's a researcher at the Imperial College in England, had patients who told him that when they were going through it, they felt as if their brain was like a computer. Their brain was being defragged like a computer hard drive, or at the end of it, they felt as if they'd been rebooted, which is so different to a mythological interpretation. It just shows you how people, depending on their circumstances, their conditioning, their belief systems, can interpret these experiences in so many different ways. And I think that's important because people tend to believe that their experience is unique, and it might be unique for them, but it's not absolute. There are no absolutes. You come back to Earth after the experience and you've still got an ego, and you interpret the experience the way you want to interpret. The final one I call mind-blowing because it's beyond description. It's what anyone ever wants to do. So it's the fifth one. You can put anything else in that category. So that's all I wanted to talk about tonight. I hope that's been helpful, and thank you very much for listening.
Wow. Thank you, Nigel. Let's all applaud for Nigel. That's just outstanding. Ilan, we're just going to these last couple of slides, and then Nigel is going to be here for questions, and we've got some wonderful questions that have been pre-submitted, Nigel, so that's exciting. And so a couple of things that we wanted to mention. One of them is this wonderful quote by Tim Ferriss: "I view the next 5 years as an absolutely golden window. There's an opportunity to use relatively small amounts of money to have billions of dollars of impact in terms of helping people heal mental illness and to affect millions of lives." He's saying this as a philanthropist to this whole space. There just aren't that many opportunities that are so dramatically obvious. If you want to bend the arc of history, I think this is one of the best opportunities you will ever have. And that's a call to action to all of you, if you go to the next slide, Ilan, to help us in whatever ways you can. And we often get asked, how can people help? Of course, you know, joining these sorts of events is important, and then starting conversations so that more and more people understand how important these medicines are, and really understand the science and the facts like Nigel has been sharing, so that the misconceptions and the myths about these medicines are dispelled. There's also wonderful opportunities to volunteer at our office or remotely, and join our state and regional chapters, or start a chapter in an area we don't currently have a chapter. We have a wonderful Learn section on our website. It's also important to talk to your doctors and medical professionals and other psychiatrists who are not as knowledgeable as Nigel, and then to help us, because we're a charity and we can't do this alone, and we rely on the generosity of a range of both large and small donors. We have, I think, over 150 donors at the moment, and you can donate monthly, and it all makes a difference. Don't think that your donation won't make a difference, because it will. Follow us on social media, of course, talking to your local MPs, and attending not only these sorts of events, but our summit and others. We'll just move to the next slide now. And this is the slide on the summit, which is a 2-day summit preceded by a 2-day pre-summit introductory workshop program in psychedelic therapies for therapists, health professionals, and members of the public who want to understand psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And on the next slide, you can see the incredible lineup of speakers who are speaking at our summit. Wonderful group of extraordinary leaders in this space. And the next slide, please, Ilan. And this is the rest of our webinar series. So our next webinar on Wednesday, June the 3rd, which will be about expanding the paradigm for the treatment of sexual abuse, presented by Dr. Alana Roy and Melissa Warner. This will be an absolutely fascinating presentation. We encourage you to share this and to get on board. We also have on Wednesday, June 17th, our first virtual fundraiser, the online screening of Trip of Compassion, which is an incredible Israeli documentary that tracks 3 patients with severe PTSD through the trials in Israel in a hospital. It really is both a confronting and ultimately a very uplifting documentary that goes inside the therapy room, so you can actually see the MDMA therapy taking place with the therapists. Of course, we have our introductory workshop in the summit, and there's some other things that are bubbling away which we'll announce to you. So keep keep looking at our events side and our social media and our emails, and we'll be sure to share some more exciting events that are coming up. We also just want to do a shout out to everyone and just say, if you can tell just 2 people about this work and encourage them to join you on our next webinar or next event, this just keeps amplifying this message and educating people, and we really encourage that. All right, so now I think we're going to move to the questions. Peter, I think you had a question to ask Nigel, or did you have a question to ask Nigel as well? I've got Peter Hunt, my chair of Mind Medicine Australia, just here with us. I think you had a question to ask Nigel to kick things off.
Yeah, Nigel, I thought that was a fabulous presentation, and what I got from it, and I'd love you to comment, is that one of the challenges with depression is a sense of disconnection or a sense of lacking
separation,
lacking meaning in your life. And one of the beauties of these therapies properly given, I'm talking about psilocybin here, is that the experience in the right controlled environment with the right therapist and the right integration can give you a wholly different view of life and the connectedness that we all have with each other and with every living thing on this planet. Is that how you're seeing it, or am I sort of overstating it?
No, I think that's a good approximation. These things are always extremely difficult to put into words. They're so subjective. But yes, that is the experience that so many people report, that they felt alienated, isolated, and suddenly there was a breakthrough, and they connected with things that they hadn't really connected with since childhood. In fact, it's really like going back to childhood where everything is awe-inspiring. You look at, if you take a young child for a walk, and it could take, half an hour to walk 2 feet, because they're just captivated by everything. They're connecting with everything. And I think that's really what happens with these substances. They really release something. You're free of narrow perspectives, and you're released, and you make these connections, which can be very life affirming, and and continue on for some time. They're curative.
Yeah. The amazing persisting nature of the experience.
Yeah.
And Nigel, just to extend that, how does that experience or that methodology of treating depression change with the experience methodology of an antidepressant?
You mean, can you compare that to antidepressant, the effect of an antidepressant?
I think it's a very different approach, and antidepressants, look, different people, it's interesting really, different people report different effects with antidepressants. Some people feel great. They certainly don't have a revelatory experience, but they just feel less connected to bad feelings or disconnected to feelings completely. It depends on the individual. So there's just less of that sort of negativity. Whereas psychedelic drugs, psilocybin and so forth, really open up a huge sort of range of connections and experiences, feelings of sort of almost liberating. And so people can make a completely fresh start and begin again to live and enjoy life. There's a huge increase in the quality of life, whereas antidepressants just make you feel a bit better. They don't make you feel fabulous or connected, but you can learn to live with the problems that you have.
And of course, one of the other drawbacks of antidepressants versus psychedelic therapy is that you don't feel as empowered for your own healing. The psychedelic therapy really gives you that sense of agency to go on that healing journey and not have to take a pill every day, right?
Yeah, well, you certainly don't have to take a pill every day. And the other thing about antidepressants is that they have side effects. And as you said earlier, Tanya, they're very hard to get off. So you might have a bad run for a few months. You take the antidepressants and then you want to get off them. And there's often a confusion about, is it the withdrawal from the antidepressant, or are you still depressed when you try and get off them? And no one really knows that. I think they're very hard to get off. And I antidepressants, there's a lot of people who take them for years and years. And look, I'm not saying they don't help people. I'm not saying they're useless. They are used and they are helpful. But to take them for long periods sometimes can be counterproductive, I think.
Just before we go to some of the questions that we have been pre-submitted, there is a question on the chat feed which is important and relevant, which is, while the introduction of psychedelic-assisted therapy is welcome and needed, there is another huge need: psychological and psychiatric support for psychedelic users, particularly integration, that are doing it themselves and will keep doing it whether they are recognised. I think they mean whether they are legal or not. So what we want to say to all of you, and we will share this with you, and perhaps Erin, if you could share the link for everyone. We have set up a psychological support services service, and it is available to all of you or any of your friends or networks. So if you are using the medicines and you want some support with your experience, or you want some support with your integration overall, and you need to talk to someone, Dr. Alana Roy is the practice manager of that, a wonderful psychologist, and there's a whole team of clinical psychologists and others around Australia who are supporting this psychological support services program that we have. So please feel free to share that and to approach us for any support that you are needing.
Just to be, I mean, that service is there, but just to be absolutely clear, we're not in any way trying to encourage people to go out there and take psychedelics. We're really focused on this happening in a medically controlled and legal environment.
That's true, but we accept that, you know, it happens. And we want to support people in the best way that we can. All right, Nigel, I'm going to go to some of these excellent questions. Firstly, this one around addiction. What recovery programs are in place for addicts who turn to psychedelics for an alternate path to treatment?
Well, there's nothing official or legal available at the moment using psychedelics. That's the plan ultimately. But we've got to do some trials using psychedelics, and they're happening overseas to help people deal with addictive problems. But that will come, I think.
And this next question, what needs to be put in place so that psychiatry sees these psychedelic therapies as at least equivalent to current psychiatric medicines for treatment options?
Well, I've been at it for years. I think we just have to keep talking about it. I think Mind Medicine's contributing to it. I think we've got to get as many psychiatrists involved in this process as possible and educate the psychiatrists and show the results of research, which is happening more and more. And I'm confident that the dam wall will break and that psychiatry in general will come on board. There's still a lot of resistance, particularly in this country, but I think all of us are pretty optimistic that that will change in the coming years.
And it's wonderful to see, you know, we have such a wonderful panel of psychiatrists now at Mind Medicine Australia. I think over 15 psychiatrists, leading psychiatrists like you, Nigel, who are very supportive of this work, and that's fantastic. This next question, I think for you, Peter. How do you address the issue of these medicines being so dramatically less profitable for the pharmaceutical industry? We know that the pharmaceutical industry is making a lot, in capitals, of money prescribing lifelong ineffective drugs. Surely the introduction of safe, effective psychedelics, which only need to be administered short-term, will cost Big Pharma billions of dollars in lost revenue. We all know that in our capitalist, consumer-driven economy, often the bottom line is the almighty dollar.
Yeah, look, the first comment to make about that is the assumption that pharmaceutical companies are making a huge amount out of medicines for mental health. The reality is that most antidepressants, which is the primary medicine that's being used, are off patent. And that means that they can be copied by other white label pharma companies, and that really crashes the margin down. So the actual margin that the pharma companies get from these antidepressants, most of which are off patent, is actually pretty small. The other thing we're seeing is a number of pharma companies actually leaving the space because they find it too hard. And, you know, when you hear Nigel talk about the complexities of consciousness and the brain, you sort of understand why pharma companies would find it too hard, because the amount of investment they've got to put into finding remedies is absolutely enormous. So it's not clear that they are making huge amounts of money in this space. What some people are now trying to do is modify the psychedelic molecules to make them more effective. And it may well be that those sort of things will be sold to pharma companies in the future. But, you know, psilocybin itself is a natural product. It can't be patented as the pure product. MDMA was, which is the other, which Nigel talked about last time with PTSD, that's been around as a synthesized product since 1938. So again, you can't patent pure MDMA. So in that sense, I think we're safe from the risk of big margins being charged for these medicines, but we've got to keep a very vigilant watch. And that's one of the reasons that we set up Mind Medicine, to make sure that these medicines were available in a legal form through psychiatrists, but as cheaply as possible, so every Australian would have access to them irrespective of wealth or background.
Also, a wonderful question here for you, Nigel. I understand the success rate with psychedelic therapy is believed to be 60 to 70%. What effect, if any, does it have on the 30 to 40% for whom it is not as successful?
Oh, I think that varies. I think it really, some people struggle to have a peak experience. You know, there's a range of results. I think some get better, some there's no change, and some people can't cope with the medication. It's not for everyone, and it's not a panacea, as I said. But that figure of 60% just shows you that a huge number of people are helped or can be helped, and that's just the main reason why we've got to keep on with this process and get the stuff out there and get people treated with these processes, psychedelic processes.
And this question, thank you, Nigel, for I think for Peter. Peter, this is really, I think, a question about the SASB scheme, but what legislation needs to change to allow these substances to be used as medications? It'd be good to talk about SASB because we haven't talked about it yet. And how do we most effectively motivate politicians to make these changes?
Well, I mean, dealing with the second part of the question first, there is an enormous focus at the moment on mental health. And that's been, that focus has increased with the pandemic. And the politicians, to their credit, are actually reacting to that. And generally speaking, recognise the need for further investment, further support in the space. So what I would say about politicians is it's important for all of us to look for opportunities where we can keep raising with them the need to be proactive with mental illnesses and treatments, and to seek new treatment modalities. The first part of the question relates to the legality of psychedelic medicine. There is a route that can be taken in Australia which legally enables psychedelic medicines to be used through psychiatrists. And that's through application under what's called the Special Access Scheme. It's an application made on a case-by-case basis to the TGA. Think medicinal cannabis. Medicinal cannabis, the way you access medicinal cannabis through your doctor is through that same Special Access Scheme. So there is a legal avenue available, and it's one that can be used. And we know that the TGA believes that it is an appropriate mechanism to gain access to these modalities.
So if you have a psychiatrist, or if you know psychiatrists, let them know about the SASB, because it will be a wonderful way to treat people who are treatment resistant to all other treatments, and to help get them well as building important data that can then be used to help make sure that these medicines become legal sooner rather than later. Someone in the chat feed has mentioned Ben Sessa's book, The Psychedelic Renaissance, and I forgot to mention before that Ben Sessa is going to be on the Q&A panel for the Trip of Compassion virtual fundraising event, and it's going to be fascinating hearing him speak about PTSD and addiction and so on. He's an expert in that space. So we encourage you to register for the Trip of Compassion and also get to talk with Ben Sessa on that night.
Just with Ben, for those who don't know, Ben's actually running a trial in Bristol in the UK using MDMA therapy for people who've got alcohol addiction. And he's getting some extraordinary results. He's finding that people who go through the therapy, alcoholics who go through the therapy, having gone through it, they can actually socially drink again, which normally is a no-no for somebody who's been an alcoholic. They can socially drink again without actually having the urge to drink more and more and more, and go back to their problems with alcoholism. So Ben's going to be speaking at the summit, and that's going to be the topic that he's going to be focusing on. The use of these so-called, people refer to these often, wrongly refers to these drugs as addictive, or these medicines as addictive. They're not. But not only are they not addictive, they can actually be used to treat addiction. So they're turning the whole thing right around.
Question here, Nigel, for you. What are some of the ethical challenges that you think might be faced with the integration of psychedelics into mainstream mental health treatment paradigms?
Well, I think the thing has to be quite well controlled, and I think that the therapists have to be well trained, because as I said earlier, people become very suggestible on psychedelic drugs. We don't want to see people being led astray, and so ethics are very important. And I think the training of psychedelic therapists is key. And I think that one of the things that's very important in the selection of therapists who work with patients using psychedelic psychotherapy is that they have to question themselves as to why they want to do that. I talked about all those sub-narratives before. The main thing is that they should be there to help and to treat and to get people over their psychiatric problems, not for any other reason. So the transference process is very important. And I think people who work with psychedelic drugs need to be people with good psychotherapeutic experience. There are boundary issues, of course, with psychotherapy, any psychotherapy, including psychedelics psychotherapy. So the normal sort of ethical approaches to any psychotherapy is important. And I think that that's why psychiatry is going to have to play an important role in this whole process, because we're already established as medical treaters. Some of us are psychotherapists, and I think that the psychedelic model will fit very neatly and snugly into that, and we can use our ethical approach, which is very important.
One of the questions that's just come up on the chat feed, Nigel, is wouldn't it be great if these medicines could be available to palliative care practitioners? And I just wonder if you want to comment on depression and anxiety amongst people who've received a diagnosis of terminal illness, and the trials that have been done, or the trials that have been done and are currently being done at St Vincent's.
Yeah, well, there's been trials overseas, particularly in America, using psychedelic psychotherapy for people with terminal diagnoses who are very anxious and depressed. Not everyone finds it difficult to cope with imminent death, but there are a lot of people who really do find it difficult, understandably, and can't come to terms with it. The research has shown that psychedelic psychotherapy can be very helpful for these people going through that transformative experience where they make these connections beyond their own egos, because really coming to terms with death is really coming to terms with the loss of yourself and feeling comfortable with that. I mean, it sounds a little bit difficult, but it is possible. And a lot of people don't cope with death very well. And these treatments actually show people that their connections, going back to the word, they're connected to a much bigger world than they realise, and the world will go on even if they're not there, but they can live with that. And it's sort of opening up their mind to that. And the results of the treatment have been very effective, and they've helped a lot of people. And there's now a research program, as you know, I think Mind Medicine's helping to fund it at St Vincent's Hospital, which is just beginning using psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety and depression. And we're all pretty optimistic that this research will have very good results.
Final question for you, Nigel, except we'll then just have, what we'll do in a moment is we'll, Ilan, unmute people's microphones if they want to raise their hand and ask a question, the more casual, just last few minutes. This question here, Nigel, this says, firstly, thank you for your amazing work and humility, which we all appreciate. Is there anything unique to your experience in training to be a MAPS accredited psychedelic therapist that has caused you to change your mind about something, psychiatry or otherwise, or change the way you treat patients outside the context of psychedelics?
I think not so much I think the psychedelic experience itself has had an effect on my practice as a psychiatrist, as opposed to my training as a psychedelic psychotherapist. I've had number of experiences, and that's really opened my mind up to the way that people's minds work. I try and be empathic with patients to try and, this is what I've said tonight is really the way I operate as a psychiatrist. I try and, sounds crazy, but I try and get inside people's minds to try and understand what they're feeling, experiencing, thinking, and then really help them heal themselves. Very much part of this, as I talked about a couple of weeks ago, is the psychedelic therapy is for people to heal themselves, to promote people's self-healing. And that's what the treatment's all about. So my treatment of people, or the way I deal with my patients, is to encourage them to help themselves. I'm not there to tell them what to do or show them what to do. I'm there to understand them, actively listen to them, and then encourage them to find resolutions for their problems. That's my approach, really.
Lovely, lovely. I also just wanted to mention that Nigel is kindly chairing a circle of psychiatrists, and our first meeting is tomorrow. So if there are psychiatrists who want to be part of those conversations, we welcome you. There's also a clinical psychologist, Campbell, who's put a note on the chat feed. And Campbell, if you'd like to reach out to us, you might also like to run a clinical psychologist circle that actually, discusses and provides more resources and support for psychologists who are interested in this work as well. Now we're going to see if anyone is raising their hands. Ilan, if you'd like to point those through to us and bring them up the screen so that we can open the conversation a bit more, that would be great. You can, I think everyone can speak, is that correct, Ilan? I hopefully can hear Ilan shortly. Hello, Ilan?
Yes, as long as everybody unmutes themselves first. Everybody has got permission to unmute themselves. So I can see.
But just unmute yourself when you're going to ask a question. So
yeah. I can see that Rupert has raised his hand first.
Okay, Rupert.
Hi, great talk. Really enjoyed it. Thanks. Particularly like the sort of sub-narratives that you've sort of delineated. I work with ketamine, and I'd like to ask what you think the effect of the experience with ketamine and S-ketamine is going to have on the adoption of psilocybin and MDMA.
Well, the best person to answer that is Nicola, really. I can see Nicola sitting there. I'm not the biggest fan, Nicola knows this, I'm not the biggest fan of ketamine. I've seen it with depression. I'm not impressed by its potential, although I know it's being used in England for depression. I just think that ketamine's a drug that's harder to control in a therapy situation. But look, I'm no expert on it. And Nicola, do you want to answer that question? Can you hear us, Nicola? He's not going to respond. Anyway,
Can I come back and just ask the question about the question was less about what you thought about ketamine, but more about what the professional and narrative issue about ketamine and S-ketamine being available, and in the case of S-ketamine being licensed for the treatment of depression, and what impact that experience is going to have on the future adoption of psilocybin and MDMA.
Well, I think it could be harmful, to be perfectly honest. I think there's great debate about use at the moment and whether enough research has been done to substantiate its allowance as a treatment method. It worries me. I'm no expert on it, but it concerns me that there hasn't been enough research and it's being released too early.
Can I just say, just for the record, I mean, the data on S-ketamine, there's no other antidepressant that's ever been released that has had 1 year safety data on it. So I think, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I think that we have to think about, what safety data is going to be required for psilocybin and MDMA to be better than this S-ketamine data that's already been released. And I declare an interest. I have You know, I've been involved with Janssen, but I've also run a ketamine clinic as well. So I'm really interested in. I completely thought the best part of your talk was about stewardship. We have to really look after these drugs, and I think that there's a risk that I agree with you. There's a risk that ketamine will queer the pitch for psilocybin and MDMA, and I think that you know but it's coming. It's licensed.
Yeah. Is it licensed here too?
Well, I don't know about Australia. It's been licensed in the UK, just been authorised recently.
Yeah, that's right. And there's great debate about whether it should be. And I suppose only time will tell, but it does concern me that it's going to get out there and be used by different people. And the question is, I mean, what I'm trying to do in Australia is get a group of psychiatrists together so that we can discuss how we use psilocybin, how we use MDMA. At the same time, I'm involved in research, develop the training of psychiatrists, give them knowledge, educate them, and slowly introduce these drugs in a very safe way so that mishaps don't happen. But the ketamine situation does concern me because it could stuff it up for everybody else. And, you know, I'm worried about it, but there's not much I can do about it. I just think we have to watch it and be very wary of the risks.
Yes, I really love to talk more about it. I think there are things we can do about it, about exactly that risk.
Rupert, just a thought. We're very interested to know your thoughts. Would you like to email us, and we can also connect you with Nigel and with Peter and potentially with Nicola as well, and we could discuss this further directly. Would that be possible?
Great, many thanks.
No, it's a pleasure. Now let's give some others. Ilan, who else has got their hand up, please? Is the hand waving function set up? You know there's a hand waving.
Yes.
Is there Michael? Michael, have you got your hand up there? No.
You have to go into participants.
No.
Okay. Any other questions? Any questions there, folks?
You have to go into the through the participants tab.
Has raised their hands.
Has anyone else raised their hand?
Sorry, Dave, if you want to ask your question.
Okay. Get rid of the echo. I just, if no one else is going on there, I want to go on a little bit more with the ketamine thing. With the ketamine theme, because when I look at, and I've been following the research in the US on ketamine, including from the established clinics, and I can see two ways of that the work with ketamine is going, where one is on a completely pharmacological level, and is it the psychedelic, is the equivalent of the psychedelic microdosing. You take small amounts, a lot more often, you don't feel the effect, and you let the thing build in your body. The other one is the psychedelic-assisted therapy, where the person has a psychedelic experience under the ketamine, and that comes with all the treatment and everything else. It seems like the focus on S-ketamine has taken it out of the realm of psychedelic therapy, and I think that a lot of bad is being done for ketamine. If you look at the work of people like Phil Wilson and other people that are seriously researching this for a really long time, they're learning things about the psychedelic therapy process that the people that are stuck in strict research protocols can't yet get to. I think that when the psychedelic community embraces what's happening with ketamine and learns from it, that everyone will be greatly rewarded. And as far as what ketamine does for the improvement of psilocybin, I don't think it's going to be very hard to show the regulators that psilocybin is safer than ketamine.
Okay, so well, Sean, again, this is very valuable, and again, I encourage you to reach out to us because you know, your knowledge and wisdom is important. Where are you based? Sean, where are you based? Oh, you're muted, Sean.
Yeah, I'm based in Israel.
Oh, wonderful. Sean, if you wouldn't mind reaching out, Peter and I met in Israel, so we're very fond of Israel. Okay, so Deb has a question. Deb? That's Karen.
Yeah.
Ilan, can you find Deb, or is Deb still there? Or
Deb is unmuted. Hello,
Deb's
Deb.
unmuted. Deb, can you ask your question?
No.
No, Deb can't ask a question. Okay.
And
Ilan,
Deb's
who else has got questions, if you don't mind?
There are no more hands up.
No more hands up? Okay. So I think we'll wrap it up there and say a huge round of applause for Nigel.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel.
And thank you all for your participation, and we welcome any further questions or inquiries through to the Mind Medicine Australia website, and we look forward to seeing you at our next events. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening or day or wherever you are in the world. Thank you. Thank you.